Okay, so we are beginning our 43rd meeting in the context of this study on electoral reform. We have with us today from Forum Research, Mr. Lorne Bazinoff, President and CEO of Forum Research, Mr. William, is it Shatton, Research Director. Appearing as an individual, we have Mr. William Cross, Professor from Carleton University. And from the Canadian Federation of University Women, we have Sheila Lacroix and Madeleine Webb. We also have with us in the audience the political science class of Professor Paul Thomas from Carleton. So welcome. I hope you'll find our discussion interesting.
That's awesome.
And that you'll do all your term papers on electoral reform. They've already written them? Okay. She went to Carleton, so she's got the inside scoop on them. Okay. So, Mr. Cullen?
We pass a motion when everybody gets it.
Thank you. I'm not interested in taking too much time from our excellent panel this morning. I made notice to the committee last night of a small motion, and also welcome to our friends from Carleton, that best behavior, by the way, everybody, I guess is what you were trying to say, Chair? Okay, got it. That the committee invite the Minister of Democratic Institutions to table a summary of her public consultations with the committee.
So you're asking for consent or unanimous consent?
I don't know.
We'll start there, I guess. We'll start.
Yeah, we can start with UC if that feels good, and we can go down from that if it doesn't work.
Shall we have Mr. Reid and then somebody on this side?
I just want to ask Mr. Cullen, I'm not suggesting any changes to the motion. I just want to confirm, when he says to table it, does he mean to table it in person and actually come before us as a witness, or simply to provide a written summary?
I suppose I was leaving that to her choice. I mean, we have a few meetings left, so if she wanted to present, I would certainly welcome.
Okay.
Yes, Ms. Romanello.
There's a minimum of 48 hours of notice. We do not have that 48 hours of notice. Therefore, I ask that this be respected. Thank you.
One moment, please. I'm told there isn't in this committee there isn't a minimum time limit.
Mr. Chair, we passed that motion the first meeting where we said any substantive motions must be given 48 hours notice. We have not had that, and therefore I respectfully ask that that be maintained.
I will just double check the motion with the clerk. Read the motion that we adopted, that 48 hours notice be required for any substantive motion to be considered by the committee unless the substantive motion relates directly to business then under consideration. So it seems clear to me that it relates to what we're doing. Yes, Mr. Cullen?
Yeah, and that was, there was no intent to I mean, we talked about it last night. This is simply what I assumed was an oversight from the minister's office, that the minister is both the Minister of Democratic Reform but also a member of Parliament. We just noticed that, and we could be wrong, that she may have submitted her results from the town hall already. But if not, then if the oversight is made, we would certainly invite her to tell us what she learned in her constituency of Peterborough. I don't think it's what every other MP has done and what the committee has been receiving.
But are you saying, Mr. Cullen, that you would like to know if the minister submitted a report from her town hall held in Peterborough?
At a very minimum, I would imagine she might also, she has also been touring the country, as we know,
Yeah.
Chair. want to give us a summary of what she learned from those meetings as well. I don't know why she wouldn't, because this is all funneling into the Democratic Reform Committee,
yeah.
on which we are then make an informed decision and then recommend something back to the government.
We'll check if she submitted a report as MP for Peterborough. We'll check that. If not, given, I'm just thinking now, there was a deadline of the 14th.
Yes, I know.
So would we be in a position to take a brief from the minister at this date?
Whatever format it would come in, there's no ill will in this motion. It's as simple as it is, and it is in conjunction with the work that we are doing. We're just simply asking...
You're asking for a brief, basically.
Sure. Well, what it says, a summary of her public consultations with the committee.
Okay, Mr. De Courcy, please. Mr. De Courcy.
Filibustering and doing this bullshit.
Look, I appreciate the motion put forward by Mr. Cullen, and it's simple in what it states, and I have no aversion to asking the minister to table a summary of her report, although I do have concern that mixes the work that she's doing, right, and the work that we're doing that is to be tabled to Parliament for her offering in the development of legislation. I do have concerns with bringing her back in front of the committee. We've already heard from her, and she's been busy talking to Canadians in a different process. So if we're getting into a conversation about what actually tabling a summary means, then I would respectfully ask that we move this whole conversation to a later point so we can get to the witnesses. If we're simply asking that she table a brief summary of the discussions that she's had with Canadians across the country, I'm less averse to moving quickly on that.
Ms. May, please.
Thank you. I'm surprised that this is appearing to be controversial in any way partisan. I would put forward the possibility, having had a town hall with the minister in my own riding, that it could be that there are reports from all her consultations submitted from me in the case of the hearing that she attended, the town hall we had on Saturna Island. I know that before she got to Saturna, she was in Whitehorse with Larry Bagnall. He may have submitted a report, but I don't think there's any intent to be putting her on a spot, not bringing her back to the committee. What I look at as how we have consulted Canadians, there's been three streams. What we've done as a committee, which is extensive, what individual MPs have done in their own town halls, and this other piece, the parliamentary secretary and the minister consulting with Canadians. If her summary is one page that says I was in the following places, and as you know, reports have been filed by the relevant MPs in those places, that's it. And I saw this as an invitation to cover off the possibility that, as busy as the minister is, we don't want our procedural rules that October 14th was the deadline to suddenly find ourselves unable to accept a written submission. I don't want her to come back before the committee as a witness. I don't see any benefit in that. I mean, I'll be blunt about it. I don't see any point in that. But I don't want to foreclose any consultation evidence into this committee from the minister, which I've seen as an important part of the stream of information that we're receiving as a committee. Thank you.
I should mention that we did receive a report of a town hall held in Peterborough. So that would be the minister's report at a town hall as an MP. So we did receive that. Monsieur Boulris.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it would be very interesting, after having listened to the minister at the outset of this consultation, to see the minister at the end of this consultation, particularly because, as Ms. May has just said, there were three streams, parallel streams, happening, and the minister herself held her own consultations, had her own meetings with citizens, and also I would like to be able to hear what she has heard from Quebecers and Canadians.
Mr. Reid.
Oh, wait, is it my turn?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so I was just saying, I actually do think, the reason I asked Mr. Cullen the question about her coming here is, I actually do think it's essential that she come here, and I think it's essential for the following reason. When she came here in July, July the 6th, I think it was, she said, in response to a question from Ms. May, will you follow the recommendations of this committee? She said, I'll take it into consideration. That's all she said. So we did not know at that point what amount of weight we're going to have. As of yesterday, we learned that the Prime Minister is indicating that he may give some weight or no weight to the work the committee is doing. This is of foundational importance to the committee, knowing whether or not we are working on something that is going to go nowhere. I want to be able to ask her about that, to get confirmation. Is it the case that this committee's work will all be for naught? That seems like a reasonable question to ask. And to add to this, I want to add a very important point. While this committee was traveling and went to Montreal and St. John's, the reason I didn't join you was that I stayed here and in this room was able, at a different committee, the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, to question Marc Mayron. Our exchanges are a matter of public record now. And in those exchanges, what I asked him was about timing issues. He has indicated the timelines are very, very tight. He thinks he can manage to bring in new legislation based on our recommendations as long as, and he says this, you can see it, he says, I'm drawing tremendous weight from the committee's recommendation.
I just want to bring up
Ms. Sahota, do you have a
point of order. Yes. Is this a new motion we're getting right now, or should we get it in writing and then discuss it later because we've got witnesses here?
Well,
should we discuss Mr. Collins' motion and
here's
get
what
over with that?
I think, you know, where we're going now is where we seem to be going from asking for a summary of public consultations to a request for the minister to appear. That seems to be where we're headed. What I would suggest, because we have witnesses and we can't extend the time of the meeting today because we know we're no longer at night where we have a wide open evening ahead of us, that we take this up this evening. Would you agree, Mr. Cullen?
That seems reasonable. I'll end my presentation with the words I gave, and I'll take it up this evening if I could.
Yeah, perfect.
I might, if you don't mind my saying so, I might actually introduce a motion that would deal with the issue of actually having the minister testify for the reasons I gave. If we don't get the timing down, everything we're doing will be for naught, and she plays a critical role in that.
So why don't we do that this evening, and we'll have we won't be under pressure. We can have a better discussion. So is there unanimous consent to do that? Would you agree?
Like I said at the beginning of all this, I hope this would be quick. Apparently, it's causing some consternation. So
we'll do it this evening.
From our witnesses. So.
And Mr. Cullen agrees with that. So we will do that, which allows us to thank you, Mr. Cullen, which allows us to proceed with forum research for 10 minutes. So you can split your time, 5 each or whatever you decide. We'll start with Mr. Bozinoff, if that's what you wish.
Great. Good morning. I'm Lauren Bosnoff, President and founder of Forum Research, the publisher of the Forum poll. Forum does more media polls in Canada than all other polling companies combined. We feel that public opinion research can be called the pulse of democracy. With me today is William Shatton, our Director of Research. I want to thank you for the opportunity to address the committee today. Forum is a nonpartisan organization, and as such has no agenda or bias regarding the issues we poll, and specifically electoral reform. I'd like to make just a couple of comments before my colleague presents some detailed findings. I would in fact suggest that the committee keeps in mind 3 things. I call them the 3 C's. The first one is collaboration. Are Canadians aware of this committee, and do they understand what the committee is studying? And sadly, we'll see in a minute, the majority of Canadians are neither aware of the committee or understand the reform options. 2, consultation. Electoral reform is about changing the rules of the game. Has there been effective consultation with all Canadians before final recommendations are implemented? Here I'm talking about mandates and referenda. And 3rd, consensus. Is there or has the committee built a consensus concerning electoral reform? And I can tell you as of last week, there is no such consensus among Canadians on the specifics of electoral reform. Mr. Shatton will now present some detailed survey findings. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for hosting us today. So my name's Mr. William Shatton. I'm from Forum Research. I'm a research director. As you're aware, Forum's done several surveys on the topic of electoral reform. Most recently, we conducted one across Canada. It was in field for October 7th through October 9th. We conduct our public opinion polling surveys through a telephone random digit dial. It's conducted through what's called an IVR, Interactive Voice Recognition platform. This survey that I'm going to be discussing today has a total size of 1,143, which produces a margin of error of approximately 3%, plus minus 3%. To start off, we probed Canadians on the importance of electoral reform among a series of other competing popular issues right now facing Canadians. Electoral reform had a fairly high rating. This is on a 9-point scale where 1 is not at all important to Canadians and 9 is extremely important. Electoral reform on average across Canada had a 5.5 rating. There's some nuances to the results. Electoral reform is most important among NDP supporters at 6.6 out of 9, particularly high among residents of Quebec as well at 6 out of 9. It's least important among Conservative supporters at 4.5 out of 9. When asked Canadians, should Canada change its electoral reform system, half of Canadians indicated that we should change our electoral system at 48%. A third disagreed, and a fifth were unsure. Most support for electoral reform is found within British Columbia and Quebec, and also among younger voters. We also probed Canadians on whether they were aware that this committee had been formed. There's an even split among awareness, but just under half of Canadians were aware. There is more awareness in BC with 59% and less awareness in Quebec with 36%. Could Canadians describe the different competing electoral systems? So a fairly tough question, but we phrased it in a way that if you're asked by a friend to describe proportional representation, first past the post, or ranked ballot systems, would you be able to confidently describe these systems? There was a fairly higher confidence in proportional representation at 63, first past the post was at 54, ranked ballots at 41. However, to put that into context, we then asked, what electoral system does Canada currently have in place? Only 40% indicated first past the post, a fifth didn't know, a fifth said we have PR, and 12% said ranked ballot, 4% said we had something else entirely. So there is a knowledge gap that's existent among the Canadian public on this topic. Finally, a few more points. So we asked, what is your preference? We then went on and gave a brief sort of summative description of the 3 different systems and asked Canadians, what is your first choice for an electoral system for Canada? Most popular is first past the post with 42, followed by proportional representation at 35, ranked ballot at 23. We then asked, what is your second choice for electoral system? Ranked ballot is most popular second choice at 40, PR 35, first past the post 25. And then finally, we asked, did you vote in the last federal election in October of last year? And then we focused specifically on non-voters. We asked non-voters, what is the primary reason that you did not vote in the election? So some points that speak to this committee. So 11% of non-voters indicated the reason they didn't vote is because they felt their vote would not count. When we asked non-voters specifically, if we had a different electoral system, would that have encouraged you to vote? And 28% of non-voters said, yes, I would have voted if we had a different electoral system. Yeah, and that's the conclusion of our results. We have polled this issue several times. These releases are made available publicly, and we'll be continuing to poll this issue in the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Thank you. Now to Professor Cross for 10 minutes, if you wish.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll begin by telling you a little bit about myself. I'm a professor of political science at Carleton University, where I hold a research chair in Canadian parliamentary democracy. My research is primarily in the area of political parties and electoral democracy in Canada and comparatively with other Westminster democracies. I'm the immediate past president of the Canadian Political Science Association, and perhaps of particular relevance to your work, I was director of research for the New Brunswick Commission on Legislative Democracy under Premier Lord in 2004-05. I am, of course, acutely aware that you have been studying this issue quite intensely for several months, and have already heard from dozens of political scientists and others interested in the issue. And I suspect many of you could probably teach a master's course in electoral systems. Accordingly, I'll refrain from rehearsing the pros and cons of the various systems and the representational implications of them, and rather will use my 10 minutes to focus on something that I think is very important but has received very little attention thus far. And that is the implications of various electoral systems for the internal operations and organization of our political parties. I do have views on the other sort of more general issues facing the committee, and I'd be happy to discuss those in the question period if you would find that of use. Many of the functions of our parties and the nature of internal party democracy are affected by the choice of electoral system. These include the principal functions of our parties: selecting candidates, election campaigning, government formation, and party leadership selection. Time will not allow me to say much in detail, but I will use examples from Australia, Ireland, and New Zealand, which among them, of course, use STV, MMP, and AV, and are, I believe, among the most useful comparators, as they are parliamentary democracies with similar political cultures and democratic infrastructure to Canada. In terms of candidate nomination, if MMP is chosen, I suspect it would likely come with closed party lists. The question then is who in the party has the authority to construct the list. Using New Zealand as an example, we find that the three main parties, Labour, National, and the Greens, all hold delegated conferences at which party members elect the candidates to be on the list. The electoral law in New Zealand was changed with the adoption of MMP to require that parties use quote-unquote democratic procedures in constructing their list, and that these procedures include participation of party members. The parties differ, however, in the all-important process of determining who gets ranked where on the list, which of course is fundamental to determining who gets ultimately elected. The Greens hold a plebiscite of the entire party membership to determine this, a mail ballot. Labour does it through something called a moderating committee, whose membership has been highly contentious in recent years, as all parts of the party, as you can imagine, want to be included on that committee. Currently, its membership is quite large. Many, including the party president, relate that they think it's too unwieldy. It includes MPs, regional representatives, Maori representatives, and representatives from the party's many sectors, including youth, Rainbow Labour, trade unions, women, and Pacific Islanders. Both Labour and the Greens have rules aimed at ensuring that the representation of many of these same groups is provided for in high positions on the list, whereas the National Party does not. So our parties would have to grapple with these issues and construct an appropriate process should we adopt closed-list MMP. And you, as MPs, would have to decide how prescriptive you wanted Parliament to be in this regard, if at all, and whether or not to require something like democratic procedures. This, of course, would be a dramatic shift from the current status quo. In STV, there are, of course, multi-member districts. If we take the example of Ireland, 3 to 5 deputies per district. In the major parties, the locals hold nominating conventions similar to those in your parties, but they operate under rather expansive instructions from the centre concerning how many they can nominate, where in the electorate geographically the candidates chosen will come from, and increasingly parties are issuing a gender directive from the centre as well. This has proven in some cases to be highly contentious, creating strong tensions between local party members and associations and central party officials, as locals often wish to nominate more candidates than the centre permits. The logic of the system is that you don't nominate as many candidates as there will be MPs, or TDs as they call them, from the electorate, and the locals, of course, wish to do this in a rather unfettered fashion. Our parties would have to determine who would have the authority to make these decisions. It might be national, it might be regional or provincial, and how expansive any directives to the local associations would be. In terms of government formation, under MMP or STV, it is highly likely that we would end up with multi-party governance, and perhaps in AV as well. This, of course, requires negotiation among the parties, typically, though not always post-election, to reach a coalition agreement. The question of relevance here is who in the party would have the authority to commit to such an accord. There's considerable variance in this regard. Some of the Irish parties, Fianna Fáil and the Greens, for example, require a special party Congress after an election to approve any coalition agreement. Others, such as the New Zealand National Party, require approval from the party's national executive as well as the parliamentary leadership. If we were to end up in a highly fragmented system, which could well be the case under either of these electoral systems, government formation could prove very difficult. But at a minimum, parties would have to decide who has the authority to make these deals. Leadership selection, not something that we typically think of in relationship to electoral system, but again comes into play as a result of multi-party governance. In all three of the countries that I've taken examples from, we've witnessed cases where one of the parties in a coalition government exercises influence over leadership selection in another party. In Australia, for example, when Liberal Prime Minister Harold Holt was presumed dead, the candidate who was the favourite to replace him, William McMahon, who was serving as Treasurer in the Liberal government and had widespread support within his party, was vehemently opposed by the coalition partner, the junior coalition partner, the Country Party. And the Country Party threatened to withdraw its support of the Liberal Party if Mr. McMahon was chosen as leader. He ultimately had to withdraw from the contest so that the Liberals could maintain their governing position. Similarly, in recent Fianna Fáil governments, two party leaders, both serving as Taoiseach, or Prime Minister at the time, Mr. Haughey and Mr. Reynolds, were dumped after support parties in government, in one case the Progressive Democrats, in another Labour, threatened to withdraw their support. Both leaders still had support in their own parliamentary caucus, but in order to remain in government, they were removed. And in New Zealand, we've seen it work the other way, where National Party Prime Minister John Key has threatened to remove a support party, a smaller support party, the ACT, from his coalition if they went ahead with plans to remove and replace their leader. So what we find is something that is largely unprecedented, I suspect, in the Canadian case. Parties in coalition with one another influencing leadership selection in the other party. This could prove particularly difficult in the Canadian case, since the authority for both leadership selection and removal, as you well know, is vested in our extra-parliamentary parties. In all of these cases, the parliamentary party was able to make the change quickly because they had that authority. And I suspect this could, if we were to go down this road, it could challenge the current practice of having the extra-parliamentary party having the authority to select and remove leaders. The fourth and final area of party democracy then I'll mention is election campaigning. In both STV and in open list MMP, of course, general elections include intra-party competition, which our parties would have to learn to manage. In MMP of the New Zealand variety, we've seen a shift of emphasis away from ridings to regional and or national campaigns. The number of seats that a party wins is almost fully determined by its share of the party vote, not how it performs in the electorates or ridings. Nonetheless, local party organizations, and particularly incumbent electorate MPs, as you can imagine, want to run vibrant local campaigns, sometimes, often, at the expense of maximizing the more important party vote. New Zealand Labour, in particular, has struggled with this, and in recent party reforms created something called regional hubs for election purposes in an attempt to shift resources toward the party vote campaign. But this was not done without considerable tension between locals and the centre, as of course the allocation of campaign resources is essentially a zero-sum game. There are also implications in AV. In Australia, parties issue how-to-vote cards, indicating how they want their voters to rank lower preferences. Deals have to be made among the parties in this regard. Sometimes this is straightforward, but not always, and can result again in tensions between local party organizations, candidates, and the centre. A quick example, in 2016, an incumbent Labour MP in the Melbourne area, Michael Danby, issued his own local how-to-vote cards, asking his voters to direct their second preferences to the Liberals over the Greens. The central party, the central campaign, issued cards in the same electorate favouring the Greens as a second choice of Labour voters over the Liberals. So voters received conflicting information. There are often tensions in this regard between locals, state party organizations, and the national campaign. So to conclude, the point of all this is to say that there are many collateral effects of electoral system change that need to be considered and are often overlooked. and at a minimum, time needs to be set aside for our parties to grapple with these issues in advance of any election run under a different electoral system. Otherwise, I believe we risk a considerable shift of authority away from our EDAs towards the party centre. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. We'll go now to Ms. Lacroix and Ms. Webb. 10 minutes, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and committee members. Bonjour tout le monde. Merci pour nous avoir invités.
Thank you for having invited us this morning. Good morning.
My name is Maddie Webb. I'm here representing the Canadian Federation of University Women, where I am the advocacy coordinator. With me today is Sheila Lacroix, member of our Leaside East York Club, who spearheaded our policy on proportional representation. The Canadian Federation of University Women is a nonpartisan, voluntary, self-funded organization with over 100 clubs and almost 9,000 members across Canada. Since our founding in 1919, we've been working to improve the status of women, promote human rights, public education, social justice, and peace. We hold special consultative status with the United Nations and belong to the Education Committee of the Canadian Commission for UNESCO. We are the largest affiliate of Graduate Women International, which represents women worldwide, and CFEW is a member of the Every Voter Counts Alliance. Our members strongly believe in the importance of voting at every level. Our clubs across Canada initiate, engage in, and promote activities to educate Canadians about the democratic process. Several of our clubs have spearheaded incredibly successful Get Out the Vote campaigns, which have increased education and voter turnout in their respective constituencies. We commend the members of the committee for dedicating so much time and energy to investigating the best way forward for Canada's electoral system. In light of Prime Minister Trudeau's comments yesterday, we'd like to reiterate the urgency of changing our electoral system to make it more representative. After years of independent studies, research, and debate, it's clear that Canadians want to see change from our first-past-the-post system. The question now is, which system will represent Canadians and result in representative elections? We urge the government to adopt a model of proportional representation. Proportional representation, or PR, is the most accurate way to ensure that votes cast are translated into representation. Plurality systems such as first past the post and alternative vote do not accurately reflect votes cast by Canadians. Across the country, first past the post results in false majorities and wasted votes. Plurality systems favor regional parties and large parties with geographically concentrated support, while smaller parties with more diffuse support are underrepresented. This is evident in Canadian federal election results. Since World War I, only 4 governments have been true majorities, winning more than 50% of the popular vote. These problems are not solved by alternative vote or ranked ballot, another majority plurality system. Simply put, proportional representation will provide fair reflection of how Canadians cast their votes. Decades of research, the findings of more than a dozen committees, commissions, and assemblies, and a long history of success in the world's top democracies strongly suggest that PR is the best option for Canada. As a women's organization, we are invested in the empowerment of women both to vote and to run for office. In plurality system, women and minorities are less likely to be on the ballot. It's not because they're not electable. It's because in the nomination process, parties have historically favored white male candidates as the best choice for the winner-takes-all competition. White men are often considered to be a more acceptable candidate, and thus there's a disincentive to choose women to run. Despite the fact that women are in fact a majority in almost every country in the world, they see abysmal representation in their governments. In PR systems, Indigenous people, minority groups, and women have a greater chance of being included through party lists of multi-member districts. In fact, party lists can be zippered, alternating men and women. Lists give parties incentives to include candidates who appeal to a cross-section of the electorate. Parties can also develop quotas to include for women candidates. If you simply glance at the 3 remaining major Western democracies using first past the post, Canada, the UK, and the US, none has broken even the 30% seat mark of female representation. However, a quick look at the Western democracies using some form of PR, their percentages of women go well beyond the 30% mark, upwards of 40. PR systems tend to elect up to 8% more women than other systems. In the 2015 election, 62.6% of Canadian voters voted for parties that campaigned for electoral reform. This fact, plus the findings of this committee and past public and expert input, should provide the legitimacy required to move forward at this time. There is enough expertise in Canada to develop a made-in-Canada system, and Canadians, with appropriate education, will adapt to the voting system of PR, as did the citizens of most countries in the Western world. We have a historic opportunity here to turn years of debate, research, and waiting into a fair, representative electoral system. I hope I've highlighted the great pitfalls of our winner-takes-all, first-past-the-post system, which neither serves nor represents Canadians. Other plurality majority systems, such as alternative vote or ranked ballot, fail to overcome the shortcomings of first-past-the-post. Proportional representation is the obvious choice for an open democracy to achieve accurate representation and fair political outcomes. Thank you.
Ms. Lacroix, will you be speaking as well?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Our comments have been covered. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. The way we proceed is we have a round of questioning where each member is allotted time to engage with the witnesses, and I think we can manage 7 minutes per member. But I would ask the members to be very aware of the time, as Ms. May does, because I don't know how she does it, but that's the secret. So what I'm trying to say is, if there's 30 seconds left, because we have to be a little stricter than we've had to be when we had more open-ended meetings, we have to end at 10:45. I would just ask you not to launch into a new subject or something very involved with only 30 seconds left. So if you could be aware of that, I'd appreciate it. We'll start with Ms. Romanato for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup pour votre présence.
Thank you for being here this morning.
And to the class that's here from Carleton University, thank you for being here this morning. We have some future MPs in the room, I'm pretty sure. So my first question will be for Mr. Bosnov. I read with great interest your submission regarding the recent poll that you did, and it was interesting the question that you asked, could Canadians describe different forms of electoral system? And of course, everyone, well, not everyone, but a good majority claimed that they could. But then when prompted to explain the current system, very few were able to, which to me is indicative of the fact that there is not a lot of knowledge out there, substantive knowledge in terms of what we're trying to achieve, in terms of what do we currently have, what's the current system in place, what's the problem we're trying to address, and then what could be some possible solutions. Given that, what would you say would be a requirement in order for us to pursue changing the electoral system, given the fact that those who claim to be very aware are not as aware as we would hope them to be? If you could elaborate?
Yeah, so you know what, we need to really think about the complexity of some of these ideas, and just from the other committee members, the other testimony today, some of those systems sound to me extremely complicated, and this is in light of, we may have the simplest system right now, and people are unaware of a lot of the details of that. So when I made my opening comments about making sure there's consensus and collaboration, part of that is based on the assumption that the public knows what we're talking about, and they really don't yet know exactly what is being discussed. They're very unaware of the different systems, as our survey data has suggested, and you can ask people a question and they'll give you an answer, but you're never sure they actually understand what you're asking them. So we have to be very careful when we see survey results and we see questions about preferences. Do they even know what they're talking about? And right now, I don't think the public is there. And I'm not sure it's a good thing to come forward with a recommendation, ask the public for input, and the public not understand what they're providing input on. So that's just a warning that, this is a kind of a beltway issue to most people, use the U.S. term. It's a Hill issue. It hasn't really resonated, I don't believe, with the general population.
Okay, thank you. Actually, on that note, you just mentioned that our current system is probably the most simplest one to understand. And in a Broadbent report, the top 5 goals of a voting system, it was 55% said that it was important that the ballot be simple and easy to understand. So I know that the issue of simplicity is one that's one of our guiding principles, so I thank you for that. I'll now move on to Professor Cross. You brought forward a wealth of information that we haven't heard before, so I really appreciate your participation this morning. One thing you mentioned was under an MMP system, there was a shift from ridings to more regional focus. And so I'm just curious, what would be the outcome if you're at a local level and you're a citizen and you have specific issues that you want your member of parliament to address, and you want to make sure that your representative is focused on local issues, which is an issue in every campaign, but that the decision on who actually represents you could be decided somewhere else. So if you're in Little Longueuil, Charlemagne, my riding, and you think that the most important thing is social housing and so on, and the party that you want in is going to focus on that, but because of the national vote, that gets changed. So how would you feel as a local citizen that decisions regarding who's going to represent you can be made at a national level rather than a local? If you could elaborate, please.
Sure. Well, using New Zealand as an example of MMP, and it's important to, of course, acknowledge that there are many variants, and when we talk about an electoral system, the details really do matter. But voters, local voters, have two votes, right? They get to vote for the person they want to be their local MP and for the party they want to govern separately. And we see that in many cases they split those votes. Using the example of Auckland Centre, downtown Auckland riding in the last election, Labour received 44% of the MP vote, the electorate vote. They lost in a very close race to the national incumbent, but they only received 22% of the party vote. This is really important because it's the party vote share that determines how many seats they end up with in the legislature, not the electorate vote. So from the party's perspective, they want to try to maximize the party vote. But you can imagine the local candidate and the local members in Auckland Centre and other places, especially if they're incumbents, want resources to get them reelected and be the local electorate MP. So it's created real tension in the party, and that's why they've just moved. It'll be used in the next election for the first time to these sort of regional hubs where they hope to put a lot more resources and emphasis, not on the local electorates, but sort of regionally trying to get people to vote for the party and maximize their share of the vote on that part of the ballot.
Okay. Do I have some more time? Okay. Madame, I'm sorry, I can't see from here. I'm assuming Madame Webb? Yeah, I can't see your name, sorry. Thank you so much, and thank you for being here. Last night we actually had a vote in the House in terms of having equal, I don't want to say penalties, but having parties receive the reimbursements depending on how many women are on the ballots and so on and so forth. And I think it's incredibly important that we have more women representatives in Parliament. I'm delighted that this side of the table has 2 women sitting at this committee, so we're delighted about that.
You have 30 seconds.
In fact, the majority of us on this side actually abstained from that vote last night because we wanted to make sure that this committee could do the work that they're doing in order to look at getting ways to get more women to run. And I think the nomination process absolutely needs to be revamped. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Romanetto. Mr. Reid.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to start by directing some questions to the representatives of Forum Research, Dr. Bosnoff and Mr. Shatton. The first question I have is, have you posted the results of this? It sounds like this is a new poll and new results you're giving to us. Have they been posted on your website?
Yes, I believe they have. Yeah, if not, then they will be this evening.
Thank you. You went through a series of questions you'd asked and gave the answers to them. Did you ask, in July, you posted on your website a poll you had done which asked, do you agree or disagree Canada should have a national referendum on electoral reform before any changes are made to the way we elect our MPs? Did you replicate that question this time around?
That wasn't included in the most recent poll, no.
Okay. In that poll, you broke down, as you will well know, this is your poll, you said that 65% of Canadians felt there should be a referendum, and broken down by party, a majority in every party favored it. 79% of Conservative supporters, 56% of Liberals, 75% of New Democrats, 63% of Greens, 74% of Bloc supporters. That indicates, to some degree, a consensus on that question. I won't ask you about that further, but I would ask you, are you finding that there is cross-party consensus on the other questions you're asking? That is to say, are we divided in a partisan manner among parties in the various, the way in which we treat the importance of the issue and so on, or is there a general consensus as there appears to be on this matter?
Yeah, there's some nuances to different elements of this topic. Like, for example, when we asked a series of important issue questions on the most recent poll. Electoral reform was on there, the economy was on there, marijuana legalization, and a few others. And there were some nuances in terms of how those were ranked among, and that divided down party lines, and I sort of alluded to that previously. The importance of electoral reform is fairly high across the board. However, it's much higher with the NDP than it is with Conservatives, and Liberals fell, and the Greens fell somewhere in the middle. But that's just on importance. In terms of should Canada change its electoral system, it is across the board, regardless of party. So there's a pretty strong support for that. About half of Canadians felt that the system should be changed. Yeah, so in terms of issue importance, there's some nuances, but in terms of whether or not it should be changed, there's consistency and agreement across the board.
When you say that people give a high importance to electoral reform, it sounds like what you're saying is they would give electoral reform a high place on the policy agenda above some of the other things the government could be directing its attention towards. Is that what you mean when you say that?
Yeah, so economy, I don't have the full table in front of me right now, but economy was the highest. Okay, across the board. So economy was the highest. It ranked, average score was 8 out of 9. So that was the highest. Electoral reform fell somewhere in the middle. So the other ones, it was economy with 8. These are averages right now. Economy 8 out of 9. Climate change 6.8. Relations with Canada's First Nations 6.4. Electoral reform 5.5. Syrian refugees 5.3, and marijuana legalization 5.0. So it fell in the middle, but all of these are sort of relatively high.
Okay. There's a different way in which the electoral system would be seen as being important by people, and I wanted to run through sort of an impressionistic view I've had of public opinion based on our hearings and reading your polls and the polls of other firms and the consultations that we've been engaged in. And I want to see if you think, based on the data you have available to you, whether I'm potentially getting close to the mark or missing the mark. It seems to me that, first of all, that Canadians as a whole, both those who think electoral reform is a good idea and those who think it's a bad idea, those who would rank it high and those who would rank it low, all of them regard the actual electoral system as being of foundational importance, effectively a kind of part of the Constitution, in the sense that the British would refer to the Constitution, a foundational part of the system, whether it has actual protection under our amending formula or not. Number two, that there is not an actual majority in favor of change. There's quite a bit of wide division. But number three, that among those who do want change, proportionality is strongly favored over non-proportional options. So effectively, those who want change want proportional representation. But that within those people, that subset of the population, there is no strong preference for one or another of the proportional models. Does that sound like a roughly accurate view of where Canadians are from what you can see?
Yeah, so we didn't ask which system should Canada change to. We asked which system is best for Canada, in your view, which system is best for Canada. When we phrase the question that way, first past the post is actually the most popular, with 42%. Proportional representation was followed by 35%, as I said, ranked ballot at 23. So phrasing the question, which system do you think is best for Canada? The majority feel that first past the post is best. And when you ask it in a way, which system should Canada change to, which we didn't in the most recent one, it's possible that a PR system comes out as being the most favorable alternative. So that could be true. But in regards to your other points, this issue, yes, is ranked is a fairly high in terms of importance. And in terms of should Canada change its electoral system, it's not the majority, it's 48%, about half of Canadians, and a third disagreed that it shouldn't change.
Okay.
And there's about a fifth who are in the middle somewhere, unsure, don't have an opinion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, autour de M. Collin maintenant.
Much. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. It's especially having pollsters here. This is like catnip for politicians. You know that, right? We just want to dive in and challenge. And I have a few questions for you, but I wanted to start with Ms. Webb for a moment. I was just looking through some stats and some quotes. The minister was asked about an effort to get more women nominated just this week. And she said back to the House, we're not interested in just having more women run. We want more women winning. I found that statement confusing. You said in your testimony that there's no evidence that when women do get nominated that there's an inherent sexism within the voters to not electing them to office. Is that did I get what you said right?
Yes.
So, okay, so once, if we're looking, Canada ranks 64th right now in the world, behind Afghanistan and
Sure
Iraq and South Sudan and other great democracies. The notion then would be, if we know that once women get nominated, they do as well as anybody else, that we know we want... Actually do better.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so then the major barrier would be, it sounds like, getting women nominated.
Yeah.
Because once they get nominated, they do well, better. Okay. Well, that's strange then.
Do you want me to answer?
Yeah,
or like
sure.
Say something? Okay.
Yeah.
I think we'd both like to talk, but I will give some generalities. I don't have the exact stats in front of me, but women actually do get elected slightly more often than men do once they're nominated. It's the nomination process that really discriminates against women because of the majority system that we have, the plurality system that we have. Parties tend to think, and people who vote within parties, so party members, tend to want to elect somebody who they think will appeal to most voters, and that tends to end up being white men.
Right. So is that built-in bias within the membership?
It's once they're nominated, women do quite well. And I think Sheila would like to say something as well.
I would just like to address regionalism. In some areas, some parties have no hope of being elected at certain points of time. And first past the post definitely encourages regionalism. So even if you have women candidates, I can think of many examples. If they're in a region where the party is not popular,
seats.
there's still no hopes, because I know some excellent women who have not been voted.
So this is the two parts. If we want to get Canada, because we had this big election last year, a year ago yesterday, and many Canadians would perceive that with respect to women, things changed dramatically, but the percentage of women in the House of Commons went up 1%, 25 to 26.
That's right. And you have fewer, maybe more on the cabinet, but fewer in the committees.
Right.
Like the assisted, medical assisted death committee, I think only had one woman.
So that's, I'm in a state of confusion and mourning to hear the Democratic Reform ministers say, we're not just interested in getting women nominated. What you're telling us is that's the biggest barrier right now, plus the system in which we count. We know that proportionality helps women get actually elected once in. That whole, we heard last night from people from New Zealand and the UK that under proportional systems, those so-called safe seats, or no-win seats, depending on your point of view, diminish dramatically. Every party has to vie and every party has a shot across the country. So no longer nominating women to get your stats up. I was just looking at the statistics in terms of how nominations went just in the last campaign. My Conservative friends nominated 20% women, 28% from the Bloc, a cracking 31% from the Liberals. Greens got up to 39%, and we did 43%. We have policies actually within our party to help women get nominated specifically for this. Mr. Bosanoff or Mr. Shatton, I'm not sure who will answer this. One of the things you said in your survey is that we found electoral reform notoriously difficult to poll because explaining each system adequately is challenging. We found that when the simple facts were presented, PR is favored because it looks the most representative. What I'm confused by is the notion that you went on to explain the drawbacks and then PR went down. Is that what you were saying in your report?
So we asked if individuals could describe the different systems, and that's where PR came out on top, with 63% indicating that they felt comfortable describing what that type of system was, followed by first past the post at 54. Then we asked which electoral system is best for Canada, and which they preferred as their first choice. It was first past the post at 42, followed by PR at 35.
Right. Did you explain the distortion effects under first past the post? Did you explain that women tend to get elected less under first past the post?
So yeah, so the first section we talked about was describing these systems and then which system Canada had, and that was sort of unprompted, no descriptions on what these systems are, just trying to get a perception of knowledge on these. Then when we went into preference on these systems, we gave a very short, summative description, just in basic on what these were. So you can't really give a knowledge transfer, a civics lesson when conducting a survey. So the whole survey results indicate that there is a knowledge gap among Canadians on these issues.
And the idea is that with that knowledge gap over something so fundamental that affects people's lives, this is something that we have to battle with. Everybody says education is important. We would say something though like a trade deal affects everybody's life. TPP or CETA. I would be curious if we went into the field and said to Canadians, tell us about CETA. Tell us about what TPP is going to mean in terms of food security or energy security, drugs, pharmaceuticals. That things affect people's lives that we do here every day. Yesterday, one of the presenters from New Zealand said, you don't contract out the hard decisions in politics. Right? We get elected to do things. Some of them are hard, some of them are difficult. I'm surprised because someone's been kicking around, what was the percentage of awareness that this is happening at all?
About half of Canadians were aware this committee existed.
Wow.
Yeah,
Because
okay, we're going to have to...
love to put us up against the Transport Committee right now, or the Agriculture Committee. I'm impressed. That's wonderful news.
Not bad, actually, when you think about it.
Isn't that good news?
Yeah. Okay, Ms. May. Ms. May.
It's up from
Me?
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr.
Oh,
Chair.
I'm sorry, it was Mr. Thériault.
I thought so, but I thought we just ascended the block, so,
Non, Monsieur Thériault, excusez-moi.
Monsieur Thériault, toi, la
Toutes mes excuses, Monsieur Thériault.
Sorry, Mr. Thériault, you have the floor. Let me think about that, Mr. Chairman, before I accept your apologies. So, guests and students, I hope that our deliberations are of high interest to you. First of all, Ms. Webb, and to tell you where I'm starting from and where I start from when I speak and ask questions, let me say that Prime Minister, I'm sorry, that is, I am for gender parity, women-men parity, not only for the nominating process, but I promote effective representation in Parliament. Let me ask you a very simple question. If you had to choose between maintaining the way we vote today and add coercive measures to it to make sure that men and women had a fair share in getting candidates, or proportional representation added to stimulating measures, which way would you go? So to choose between the rules, between the way we vote now, so mixed member proportional or other measures to encourage a parity amongst candidates, or other measures? Which would you prefer?
So I'm just because I don't know all the terms in French, but thank you for your question. As a representative of CFUW, we do not have a policy specifically to address that, but I think that right now before this committee, we are asking for change. I think that what we see, I mean, we can do incentives to have more women elected or more women nominated. Some parties take that upon themselves. I think in general it's a good idea to encourage parties to nominate more women. However, I think that the real change, if we really want to see more women elected, also more minorities elected, not just women, I think that we need to change the electoral system. However, I would not say that we're advocating specifically for mixed member proportional. We are advocating for proportional representation and a Canadian version of that, whatever version that might take.
I understand the distinction you're making. Mr. Bosnov, Mr. Shatten, you've told us that the people who say they know what Canadians want, maybe speaking through their hats, when they talk about representation, I am elected member. We live in a representative democracy, and I do not pretend to know what all voters want when it comes to voting. I know what I want. What my political training wants is to change the way we vote and to introduce proportionality. And we prefer mixed member proportional representation, but we can't choose any model, just any model, and not just anyhow. And so we think that if we want to do things correctly, then we have to take the time to do them correctly. In order to do that, we have to get out of the straitjacket that the Prime Minister put us in by saying something that he didn't know what he was saying when he said it, that it will be the last election under this process of electing members. And so he has no knowledge of what it takes to change things. And so, would you be in favor of a referendum on the issue based on the possibility that there would be a second stage to our committee, which would be to elaborate a model and to continue to consult all voters in order to have them understand the differences between one type of voting identified as a type of change vote rather than the type of voting we do today, so people be aware and we be able to establish a decision. People have told us that we don't need a referendum because we represent citizens already. So if we don't need a referendum to make a change, then we don't need a referendum either to maintain the status quo. And so one is as valid as the other in this method. So if we don't want to decide on behalf of people and get out of all this political thinking, there could be a referendum between now and the next election. But do you not think that in order to get people interested in this, we should have a clearly identified model, compare it to the status quo, and continue our consultative process?
I'm going to respond in English. The public generally is in favor of referendums. They like the idea because the idea is that they're going to get consulted on something directly. So when we do a poll, and we did a poll a month ago and found 65% in favor of referendum, that's not a surprise. People tend to say, yes, the public should be consulted and so forth. I'm not convinced that they would want two referendums, though. There's always the argument the counter argument is the cost of these things, and it gets into the millions and millions of dollars sometimes. So we sometimes hear that kind of pushback. So I'm not convinced that there's interest in 2 referendums, but I think there would be a lot of interest in 1 referendum once the committee has made its recommendation and we have a concrete, there's a lot of fluidity in these results because the details are still unknown. And we don't know what the choice is going to be. And we don't know, we tested 3 options. Well, referendum's not going to involve 3 options, I don't think. So we need to know, to really get a solid handle on this, the public would need to know what is the idea. And then, going back to Mr. Cullen's point about the details and the trade agreements and so forth, I think once the public knows exactly what the details are, and they'll understand, I think, the implications through the dialogue and the run-up of a discussion. They'll understand the pros and cons. They will then know what it means to them, I think. They will know, I think they'll be able to answer in a more educated manner, well, yeah, I'm in favor of this system, or say, is this a new system versus the old system?
Okay, thank you. We'll go to Ms. May now, please.
Chair, and thank you to the committee and to all of our panel members who are here today. It's been a very good discussion, and I'm also glad to welcome a political science class here in Parliament for this really critical discussion. And I am glad we were kind of teasing between Mr. Cullen's answer to the question. When Mr. Bricker was here, his polling numbers said in August, I think it was August, that 3% of Canadians were aware of our committee. We have vaulted to 50% of Canadians aware of this committee. And that, if you turn around, you'll see the row. Perhaps the witnesses can note that the reserved for media tables are remarkably vacant, as they have been consistently in almost all of our hearings. So that I'm amazed that we got up to 50% since we're in a media blackout zone. Sorry, but my first question is, and I'm going to, although I want to identify myself as a member of the Canadian Federation of University Women, and I will try to come back to you with some more questions, but I wanted to address myself to Professor Cross. I'm grateful to you for focusing on an area we hadn't heard about, but I wonder if I could bring your attention back to something we have heard about, because I don't want to, especially since you were an advisor, perhaps you can describe your role with the New Brunswick Commission on Electoral Reform in a bit more detail, and if you'd still hold to the recommendation the Commission had then for mixed member proportional.
Sure. I spent about 18 months as the Director of Research for the Commission, working really in conjunction with David McLaughlin, who you've heard from, who was the Deputy Minister at the time. We had a small commission of ultimately 8. We lost 1. We started with 9. And so my role was really to provide the information, the research that the committee used on an ongoing basis during our meetings. We did a lot of public consultation as well across the province, and then ultimately wrote the report. My view on sort of electoral system change is that it's something that one has to approach very cautiously, and of course, and be aware of all of the potential implications. In the New Brunswick case, I think that the Commission did a very thoughtful job and created a system that they called MMP, or NB-MMP, New Brunswick MMP, that was tailored to the context of New Brunswick, which of course is unique in our confederation, with the 2 linguistic communities at the provincial level and a lot in regional dynamics among that had to be considered. I think the Commission came up with a system that it recommended that was appropriate to the province at that time. And they're now, the new Liberal government has just engaged a new process. We'll see where that ends up.
The second part of my question is, did you still think that mixed member proportional would be right for New Brunswick, or do you have any particular recommendation around, given how much time you spent working and thinking about this area in your own work as research chair for parliamentary democracy, do you have a specific preference yourself of the electoral reform this committee should recommend, or how you would suggest we prioritize the different values that we have to consider in making that recommendation?
Sure. I think you're right to begin from a position of values. I do think, and I think back to the dictionary definition of reform, which is to change something for the better. And I think we have to be very careful that the changes that we consider, that we understand the full implications and that we're making it better. Just listening to the conversation about gender. I've just written a paper that will be in the Canadian Journal of Political Science shortly on candidate nomination and gender in the 2015 election. And it's true that that's a principal obstacle, but if the intent is to get more women into Parliament, there are lots of other ways of doing that, short of changing the electoral system, if we have a real commitment to do it, which I think we should. And changing the electoral system in and of itself doesn't guarantee that. People cherry pick examples, right? I mean, Ireland, which has a more proportional system, has fewer women in their Parliament, the Dáil, than we do. It just doubled in the last election earlier this year, and that was a result of tying campaign finance reimbursements to increasing the number of women nominated. Something we could do if that was really what we wanted to do and we had that, you know, as a strong incentive. So I would just say, to answer your question, I don't have a preferred position on this. My, you know, advice to the committee would be to go slowly. I mean, I get concerned about, and that's one of the things I was trying to address, is that if we move very quickly and say the next election is going to be under MMP or AB or STV, and we don't allow time for political parties to adopt that, I think we could result in a real power grab towards the center of our parties, away from internal party democracy where members and EDAs have an important role. It doesn't have to end up that way, but if we don't leave time for the parties to consider those things and have a thoughtful conversation about them, I think that's where we would end up.
But I think you'd agree with me that over the last number of decades, or certainly since the early 1970s, when for the first time a political party's name was put on the ballot, and for the first time ever political party leaders had to sign off on nominations, it would be naive to suggest that the current process of nominating candidates across Canada in the major parties is free from top-down political control. Would you agree with that? There's been a trend towards greater political control in the centre since we put the name of parties on the ballot with the candidates' names?
Well, it's complicated. I mean, Joey Smallwood in Newfoundland, when he was Premier, issued a press release that listed who all the federal candidates would be for the Liberal Party in Newfoundland and Labrador, or Newfoundland at the time, not Labrador. So it, you know, it has flown back and forth. A decade ago, both of the parties, Mr. Harper's party and the Liberals as well, renominated all incumbents by fiat, essentially, from the centre. They backtracked from that, right? There was real pushback. I mean, as we all know, there is interference from the centre. It's contentious. But we just need to be careful in thinking about, well, how would that play out under different systems?
Okay. I'll just go to Mr. Bosanoff. It is, just to clarify, on page 8, the table 1, is this actually the description used to the people on the IVR system? This is all they were told about the different systems? Because if I'm correct in finding that this reflects only to the voter how each MP has been elected, it doesn't say anything about, and under first past the post, 39% of the vote gives you the majority. I mean, the proportionality impact is not riding by riding in its importance. It's the makeup of Parliament as a whole, which is completely absent from this description on Table 1.
Okay, very, very briefly, because we are up against
yes,
time constraints.
those are the descriptions that we used.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Aldag, please.
Great. Well, good morning to our panelists. This has been another great morning. I'm always surprised as we go through this, the new testimony that we get each day, and each of you have brought some new insight today, so that's really appreciated. I did want to start just with one small correction on a statement that was made previously when a discussion was happening about committees and how in this Parliament it's difficult to have full representation by women, and the example of medical assistance in dying was given. And I sat on that committee and just wanted to indicate that it wasn't just one woman for the entire committee. The Liberals had 2 women that participated throughout. The NDP had one, Madame Sanssouci, who had participated consistently throughout the process. And then the Senate actually had 2 of 5 because it was a special joint committee. So there was actually fairly good representation. And then we see other examples where my colleague, Ms. Romanato, sits on 2 committees, whereas I sit on 1. So sometimes women have to work harder, but we can get to that representation. or at least be present more.
Work harder.
Okay. I want to start my questioning with Professor Cross. I found your discussion really interesting, and I'll tell you where my mind has gone this morning. We've had discussions about different forms of government that really arise from proportional systems, and this idea of coalition, and I've poked around with other witnesses about what kind of policy compromises would be made, and the sense that small parties can have an unwieldy amount of weight or disproportionate amount of weight because of them being able to broker in the power kind of scheme of things in Parliament, that they end up with a stronger voice than they might have had otherwise. And but I'd never considered this in the sense of party leadership selection. You've given the example in Australia. So I'm sitting here looking across the table where we have the Conservatives currently going or starting their leadership search, and the NDP about to embark in the same process, and thinking, wow, so you're saying that Miss May could actually, with a perhaps slightly expanded Green Party, could dictate to the Conservatives who they're going to select as their leader, and the Bloc could actually get involved with the NDP and determine who is going to be ruled out or not. Could that actually happen in the Canadian context? I find that absolutely fascinating.
Well, in all three of the countries, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK, and in Ireland, this has happened. So in the 1990s, two Fianna Fáil prime ministers, Taoiseachs, were removed from office because the support parties in a coalition, in one case Progressive Democrats, in the other case Labour Party, said they would not continue to support the party in power. There were some scandals that had arisen and things unless Fianna Fáil removed and replaced their leader, which they did. Now, as I mentioned quickly, in all of these cases, the parliamentary party has the authority to remove the leader. Not the case in Canada, right, unless you were to adopt the Reform Act. One of my concerns would be just what you suggest. Let's just pretend the Conservatives are in coalition with the New Democrats, and the New Democrats demand that the Conservatives remove their leader in order to continue their support, to have their support. How does the Conservative Party do that? Through an extra parliamentary process, right? It would take a long time. So it could result in adoption of the Reform Act as a corollary effect, this sort of unexpected implication of electoral system change.
Okay, really interesting. The other piece of it that I don't know if you could comment on, but it gets into our structure within the House of Commons. Right now we have you have to have 12 members in order to have official party status to participate on committees and to get other things. And so, in this kind of coalition system, would a party that doesn't have meet that threshold by joining with another party, would they actually then be considered one party, and could that trigger additional subsidies and budgets to the smaller parties? Would it get them over that kind of barrier that they're up against right now?
In the other countries, they continue to be considered independent parties.
Okay, so they wouldn't ride on the coattails of the party that has crossed over that threshold. Okay, very interesting. I also wanted to get your thoughts on, as we were talking about, or as you were talking in your opening comments about the role of parties, and it's this dilemma about how autonomous parties should be in setting their policies, and compared to Parliament imposing their will on parties. And I do go to, as Ms. Romanato had mentioned, yesterday's vote on where there was a bill before the House that could have provided penalties to parties for not meeting targets. And I know as I was weighing where I was going to go with that one, I ended up abstaining just because we are deliberating right now, and I thought it would be premature to do that. But the idea of Parliament imposing its will on parties, I think it's this dilemma about how do you let the grassroots, which is really the foundation of our democratic system, do the right things, and where do you provide disincentives, where do you provide the stick, and where do you provide the nudging through positive incentives. And I don't know if you have any comments you'd like to offer on that, but it is one that I find difficult, how the will of Parliament versus the will of parties.
It is a difficult question whether or not parties should be viewed as private organizations, or on the other hand, perhaps as something like public utilities, because they play such an important role in our democracy and receive significant amount of public funding from the taxpayers. I testified before the Senate committee on the Reform Act, And when the act was still prescriptive, that said you had to do these things, it wasn't left up to the caucuses to decide, I thought it was a terrible act, particularly because, or terrible idea, because it did impose on our parties a particular set of values and ways that they should organize. And for the most part, I think that is best left to the political parties to determine for themselves. Although I do think the money that's given sometimes can be used as a carrot, that you could incentivize things like increasing the number of women nominated. But it is an area that I think we want to move very cautiously of, because we don't want parties to be creatures or captive of Parliament.
Thank you. Okay.
Is there?
We've got to move on. Sorry about that. I told you it's a stricter game today, so because of the time limit. So we'll go to Mr. Richards, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here. I'll start with Mr. Bosnoff, Mr. Shatton. I was shocked when I heard you say, when you were asking about the awareness of the various systems and understanding, I guess not awareness, but understanding of the various systems. And I understood you to say that the question you asked was, could you explain it to a friend? And that was a way of determining if there was actual understanding. And I was shocked when I heard you say that only 54% could explain first past the post, which was our current system. But then you went on to say only 40% could identify that first past the post was our current system. So I think that largely explains that. So I'm curious if you've ever polled on, can you explain our current system? And the reason I ask is obviously 54% was lower than the typical turnout in an election. If they voted in an election, they should understand the system they voted under. And I'm sure they would. So I'm just curious if you've ever asked, that same question, but rather than asking about first past the post, could you explain our current system? I'm just curious on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, we haven't gone into too much detail in the surveys on describing how our current system works. But just, language is important, right? So when the committee does make a decision, and if the government does decide to move forward, whether it's through a referendum or through other means, right, it's, you're going to have to, there needs to be a public awareness campaign around all of these issues, right, with whatever the decision is. And there needs to be some knowledge transfer, some education, and this is very indicative of that, right? So these individuals, just over half say they could describe what first past the post is, but I mean, if they provided an example, only 42% would indicate that Canada uses a first past the post system. So, there's definitely some knowledge gaps there.
Yeah, I guess along the same lines, to have had 52% who actually say we should, I guess they're saying we should keep our current system. When you asked, should we change, 48% said they agreed, so that would mean 52% disagreed, I would assume. So that would mean that there'd be a large number that would want to keep our current system, I would assume, potentially. But then when you asked what their choice was in terms of, first choice in terms of systems, 42% said it would be first past the post. That was the highest number, but it's still less than those who would have indicated they wouldn't want to change. I'm curious on that one, how that question was asked. Like, for example, if someone would, like, I assume they were given choices of various systems, but if someone was to say, well, our current system, would that have been considered a valid response and included with the first past the post, or would that, I'm just curious how that would have been conducted.
No, I think they had to pick one of the three options that we gave them. They couldn't say the current system, so they have to recognize what the current system is.
Okay.
And maybe they don't know what it is.
Sure.
Just remember, though, on the knowledge thing, there's no knowledge test to vote. We don't test people and say, oh, gee, you can't vote because you don't know the details of the voting system, you don't know the name of it, you can't describe it to your friend. They all are going to vote.
Of course.
They're all going to have opinions. Like, I mean, there are some don't knows in here, but we gave the people three choices, and most of them picked one of those three. Like,
no, I was just more curious on it, and I mean, it's sort of stand to reason that probably if they were able to sort of indicate the current system, they might have even made that number higher. But I would agree, there shouldn't be a knowledge test to vote, and I think there's been many that have made that argument when they're talking about referendum, saying, well, people wouldn't have enough knowledge or wouldn't understand enough to be able to vote in a referendum, and I just think that's a really arrogant viewpoint that people have in that regard, and so it's unfortunate that some people would see it that way. Now, I wanted to move on to you, Professor Cross. You had mentioned, and actually just in response to Mr. Aldeg's question, it was brought up again, but you talked about one of the unique challenges that might exist in Canada, and that was in talking about the party lists and then the other parties being able to influence party leadership choices. And you obviously have explained that because that choice in Canada is done by the extra-parliamentary membership or the grassroots membership of parties, that would obviously create a unique challenge in terms of some of these issues around the coalitions and the party lists and things like that. So I'm curious if you have thought much about some of the other unique considerations. When we're looking at a system for Canada, obviously Canada is in many ways very much different country than a lot of other countries. We're one of the largest countries in the world. We're very sparsely populated, very diverse country, and so I'm curious if you have some suggestions on other considerations that we should be thinking about in creating, if a new system was to be created for Canada. Obviously, we have to think about those unique challenges. So have you thought about what some of those other unique challenges might be that we would want to think about?
Sure. I would take just 10 seconds at the beginning to touch on something in your previous conversation, and that is that in reading testimony of some of my colleagues who have appeared before you, I can say, I think without an exaggeration, I've been shocked by the attitudes of some of them that Canadians can't learn about this issue and have an informed opinion upon it. So I just want to put that on the table. But I think there are a couple of other issues that are important in the Canadian context. One is, if I knew nothing...
I'll just interrupt you. So,
Sure.
You made that comment, so obviously you have some thoughts on that. Do you think that's an important way to proceed, is to give Canadians that option, that choice? I mean, obviously you're saying that they could be educated, and I would agree, and I think that would be an important part of that, that we should be making sure that people have the proper education to make
Sure, I think with a robust educational process, I mean, look at the New Zealand example, for instance, where there was that kind of government funded and initiated educational program that Canadians would be able to understand the basics of what's required. I don't think it's as complicated. They don't need to understand sort of the droop quota and how all the transfers might work and things, but what it would mean to them in terms of how they're represented and who represents them in Parliament. On the question I think that you're asking about a referendum, and I go there hesitantly since it's become somewhat of a partisan issue, but I do think this is a really, I take Mr. Reid's point that it gets close to being a constitutional issue. It's something fundamental. And I think in terms of fairness and Canadians' acceptance of whatever is recommended, and if we have a change, it's important that they don't view it in any way as a partisan exercise. And one way to ensure that that's not sort of the perception is that it be something that's approved of by Canadians. Now, I don't think we need supermajorities or anything of that sort.
Thanks. We'll go to Ms. Sahota.
No, we have.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses here today. It's really nice to see everybody in the audience. It was probably one of our bigger crowds that we've had in some time. So my first question goes out to the Canadian Federation of the University of Women and Ms. Webb. What would you think the paramount reason to move towards a PR system would be for your organization? What would you want to accomplish through that?
Thank you for your question. That's a great question because I think it's important for us to say that we do not support proportional representation for the only reason that it can help women get elected. That is not the only reason that we support PR. I think that the most important part of PR is that I think that Canadians, and we think that Canadians should go to the ballot box expecting that their vote is going to translate into representation. And right now, that is not the case. A huge percentage of votes get wasted under a plurality system. And I think the biggest reason to move for change is that so many votes don't count right now. So that's what I would say.
From all the different presentations, I think Professor Cross has really given us some food for thought. You know, that definitely is one of the reasons that come out most often. You know, am I going to get my, you know, say I've been voting for a party and they only have one seat or they only have a couple of seats, and so I'm a minority amongst Canadians in my political view, and I want my minority view to be reflected in the House of Commons. However, we don't think about all the collateral changes and what actually takes effect after going towards a PR system. And Professor Cross, I'd like to ask you, you've given some testimony as to the different changes that we could potentially see under different systems. Do you feel that Canadians' views would be more reflected in a PR system than they are currently reflected? Would people be able to check off at the ballot box and say, well, this is how I feel, this is my political view, and then expect that to translate into policy in the future? Or do you feel the current system has, where parties go in with a clear mandate and parties either form government or they don't form government? We don't have a tradition of coalitions here in Canada yet. PR systems may create that. We've had a lot of testimony about, it may create a cooperative environment. The collaboration could be a good thing, but we've also had testimony to say collaboration could end up causing a lot of parties to compromise what they value the most at times. We've had testimony in Nunavut recently where they have a consensus form of government saying they don't get a lot done. They can't push through a mandate, and there's frustration there that we're seeing at the territorial level. So if you could comment a little bit on what do you get as a result?
Sure, there's a lot there. And I think what you're highlighting is that there are competing principles, and you need to prioritize what it is you want to accomplish through an electoral system, because no system is best, no system is perfect and can accomplish all of these different legitimate objectives of democracy that you point to. In terms of the unexpected implications, there are two things that I'm not sure the committee has really thought about that I think it would be worth putting on the table. One is the whole question of executive federalism in Canada and how that works. If we were to move to a system of proportional representation of some sort at the federal level that resulted in coalition governments, in terms of negotiations and the rest of the premiers were still elected under first past the post, and thus most had majority governments, when they meet, does the Prime Minister or a First Minister of Health or whatever, does she have the power to negotiate on behalf of her government, or does she have to come back and make sure that she maintains the support of the coalition partners and other parties? And I think only of what happened in Meech, which was the Meech Lake Accord, which was the first time that legislatures were brought into the constitutional process, and that after the First Ministers came to agreement, it had to be approved by the legislatures, and that's where it fell apart. So I think in terms of federal-provincial negotiations, that this is something that has to be thought through. The other point is, if I knew nothing about Canada and you told me about this great country and the demographics and the like, and I've lived from coast to coast, I would say it doesn't make sense, it's not going to last, good luck folks, the centrifugal forces are too great. Yet we're about to celebrate our 150th birthday of a country that works, and it is an envy of people around the world. And as we move, and I think part of that is because we have a tradition of large brokerage accommodative parties. If a party wants to get to government, it knows it has to reach out to a lot of Canadians and find the broad centre to do that. It was the incentive for the Conservatives and Progressive Conservatives in the Alliance to merge into a single party. Under different systems, that incentive wouldn't have been there. They could have continued to be separate parties. Maybe that would be a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, that's sort of a normative judgment, but it has profound implications into the way our democracy works. So I think it's so important that we consider all, what would happen under different systems in the context of Canada, a highly diverse federal system.
We had a witness testify before this committee, and he gave a great analogy that our committee members talked about a little bit about. In an assignment that he did at school, he went in to try to teach PR to the students and used a method of ordering pizzas. So the ballot had different pizzas on it, and as a result, under a PR system, he said everyone got the pizza they wanted. They had some pepperoni and cheese, they had some vegetarian, they had something else. But as we discussed and as other witnesses like yourself have appeared, it seems to me that not everyone in the end would get what they want, because that pizza, in fact, wouldn't be one pepperoni pizza, one vegetarian pizza, you'd have a pizza with anchovies on it, you'd have a pizza with a mix of a whole bunch of things in the government at the end. So does everyone essentially get exactly what they want, or does everybody get a mismatch of, a pizza that they're allergic to at the end of the day? I don't know, but it was an interesting analogy. And do I have a...
No,
okay.
we're really done now. There's no time to answer the pizza question, unfortunately. So we'll go to Mr. Boulris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must say that now I'm hungry. Thank you to our witnesses for being with us this morning. And thank you also to all of you students in the room today. It's rather unusual to see you, and we're happy that you're here to listen to our discussion, so welcome. I'd like to begin with you, Mr. Cross. We've been living under a first-past-the-post system for almost 150 years, and now we think we might like to try something else. Most other Oriental Western democracies have a proportional type of representation, be it mixed or STV. In your opinion, what cultural changes a proportional type of representation vote would bring to our federation in the way we act, in the way the government makes decisions? How would that work here in Canada?
When I look at our system, one of the things, beyond gender representation, which I think is a huge issue, and perhaps representation of other minority groups that are currently disadvantaged and underrepresented in our parliament, but when I look over time, I think one of the most troubling things is when we have parliamentary caucuses, particularly on the government side, that don't have representation from particular regions of the country. So the Conservative government and Mr. Clark with essentially no one from Quebec, no voices at the cabinet table unless you go through the gymnastics of appointing someone to the Senate, and right. I think that's highly troubling with our system. And so I think, when I think about possible alternatives, something like what's sometimes called a parallel system or a non-compensatory system where you would have another 100 MPs or something that would be elected from the regions on some kind of party list. So, if the Liberals got 10% of the vote in Alberta, they'd get a few MPs. It wouldn't change things dramatically because it wouldn't be compensatory in the sense that if you did that, all the parties would get a share of those seats, and you could still get majority governments. It likely wouldn't affect who ultimately would govern, and you could still have single-party majority government. So, to my mind, that's one of the real shortcomings of our system. But of course, it has to be balanced off against other things. I'm sure you've heard, and it was mentioned earlier, that one of the disadvantages of our system is that it favors regional parties. I'm not sure that that's a disadvantage. I'm not sure it's at all a bad thing that when there was Western alienation in the 1980s and 90s, our system allowed reform to have some success and for that voice to be heard inside our parliament. I'm not sure it's a bad thing if there's 40% of Quebecers who are frustrated with the federal system and want to vote for the Bloc Québécois, that our system gives them a voice and an ability to do that. Now, first past the post isn't the only system that would allow that. Others might as well. But I just would point out that, while people will often point to that as a negative of our system, I'm not quite clear that is the case.
Excellent. Très bon point.
Excellent, and a very good point, in fact. Yesterday, one of our witnesses showed us models of extrapolatory models based on last elections data. He said a political party today in Canada with 40% of the vote could hope to get between 0 and 338 MPs. So with 40% of your vote, if someone else had 50 or 60% of the vote, you have no members. But with 40% of the vote, you could win in all ridings. Don't you think that the chances of this evident distortion would mean that the will of the electorate can be completely for naught by a type of voting that when you vote, it translates into a certain number of seats.
Not completely hypothetical, right?
No.
New Brunswick, when Frank McKenna won with 60% of the vote, Mr. Hatfield got 40% and no seats in the legislature. On the other hand, at the federal level and with the regionalization of our system, you know, a party's not going to win 40% of the vote and get 0 seats federally. And I would also just caution that it's very dangerous to take past election results and extrapolate them and transpose them to some other system, because the cast of players would be different and everybody responds to incentives, voters, parties, interest groups. So I think that's a bit of a dangerous game to play. But yes, of course, when you get those incredibly lopsided results that don't reflect the popular vote, that is a shortcoming of our system, and it's something that was very important in the New Brunswick case that Ms. May mentioned, but also in Prince Edward Island, where they had a series of elections in the 90s that returned 1 or 2 opposition members.
Madame Webb, vous avez dit dans une réponse précédente.
Ms. Webb, you said in a previous answer that with our current system, so many votes don't count right now. What did you mean exactly by saying that? I'd like to hear you a little more about that.
When you go to the ballot, if I go to the ballot box and I vote for my party, but that's not the party that 40% of my constituency votes for, who then wins with that 40% in my constituency because the 60% left is split between a bunch of other parties, then my vote doesn't result in any representation at all. It's just gone. So my vote only counts if I decide, like many people did in the last election, to vote strategically and to vote for a party that you think is going to win because it kind of represents your beliefs, because you think that that's how most of the people in your constituency are going to vote.
On est plus ou moins à la fin.
That's pretty much it, Mr. Boulris. Mr. Deltel. Let's continue with Mr. Mattil. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ladies, gentlemen, welcome to the House of Commons. I take this opportunity also to greet these students who are with us today. So welcome. You're seeing democracy in action. That's very interesting. And welcome to the people who are with us today and who are not at school, as I understand it. I'd like to take a moment, Mr. Chairman, to note the fact, first of all, that with one day late, congratulations. We were all elected and some of us re-elected. In my case, for the first time. This is the principle of the democracy, an issue here with our committee. We've covered thousands of Canadians at many meetings, and we've held consultations in our own fashion. Some of us have held town halls, meetings with our voters. We have sent out to your communities. Many of our MPs have sent information documents, and 80,000 people have answered. The mandate was clear. 91% of people who wrote back to us are looking for a referendum, but everyone has a different approach. The NPD have their approach, Green Party, Bloc Québécois, and the Liberals have their own approaches, and for many months now, parliamentarians have been looking at the future of electoral reform. As you know, we think that a referendum should be held if there is a voting change. We are open to this discussion, and it's up to citizens to decide. So my question to you, Mr. Bozinoff and Chadin of Forum Research, is this.
Those issues, and you have been working on that for many years. My concern is that with all of the fact that, our party and every party talk a lot about that, we have plenty of meetings and from coast to coast, and thousands of people were involved in our process. Have you seen something change in the mind of the people in the last month, in the last years, about the electoral system?
We'd have to I mean, we'd have to compare. That's something that's of interest. We'd have to look at doing sort of a time series analysis on some of our polls. It's not something that we had done in preparation to this. However, as you pointed out, awareness of your committee has grown just over the past few months. So I think there has been a positive impact just in terms of Canadians being aware that there's a dialogue taking place. But as our data alludes to, there's still, I think, significant work that would need to be done in terms of the knowledge on the issues and making sure that Canadians are informed about what the issues are regarding electoral reform.
But have you seen any move in the population mood?
Yeah, that's something we could check and get back to. As I said, we've done several surveys on this, and we're going to continue polling this issue. So what we'll do in the next poll, we poll federally every single month. So in the next release, we'll add some time series analysis. So we'll do some trending checks on questions that have overlapped between all of our polls.
If we're looking in the last years, have you seen any movement of the people saying that we need new things or new electoral system, or it's exactly the same thing for many years? A lot of people would like to make some changement, other people don't want to make any change. Have you seen any move in that in the last years? Yes.
I think anecdotally, qualitatively, we saw in the Toronto mayor election 5 or 6 years ago, a populist mayor. So I think there is an interest in the 1% versus 99% populism, accountability, the average guy getting his say, and so forth. We're kind of seeing that now going on in the U.S. Same thing, kind of a populist thing. So I think there is interest in accountability and everyone, getting their fair influence in society.
Okay, because as you know, yesterday our Prime Minister, the one who called the shot for this committee, said, quote, and I will quote it in French because he said that in a French newspaper, and I don't want to interpret what you have said, and I'm sure that those people here are very professional, and I know that they will make a good job as they always done. So, what the Prime Minister said yesterday in the Le Devoir, which is one of the most prestigious newspapers in Canada. That's right. It's true. It's true. So, what Prime Minister said yesterday, quote, sous Monsieur Harper.
Under Mr. Harper, there were so many people unhappy with the government and its approach. People said, we need electoral reform, so we no longer have governments we don't like. But in the present system, they now have a government that they are more satisfied with, and the motivation to change the electoral system is less strong than it was previously, unquote.
So we don't have explicit data. I can't recall if we polled specifically on desire for electoral reform leading up to the federal election. That's something we can go back. We definitely polled extensively prior to the last federal election. Lauren, do you recall, was that a question we ever asked on any of those leading up polls?
No, I think it's fair to say, though, compared to a year ago, how to say this, the approval rating of the current Prime Minister is much higher than the previous Prime Minister, by far. So if there is some feeling that people are happier with their government and it's reflected in the approval ratings that the current Prime Minister versus the previous Prime Minister were doing, there's no comparison. The approval rating is much, much higher currently with the current Prime
Because
Minister.
it's quite interesting to look that, you guys are professional on those issues. You can identify year after year if people are moving on for a new electoral system. And what we have seen yesterday, it's not good for democracy because this is the one who called the shot. And this is the one who at the end of the day will decide because he controlled the executive and he controlled the House of Commons, the legislative. I can tell you that at the end of the day, they decide to call a referendum, all right. A referendum on the actual system and the other, right. Not quite sure it's there, but it's very disappointing for those who think that we were in a process to have a real reflection on that based on the principle, not based on the political agenda. Okay, that's exactly what they did.
Thanks. We'll go now to Mr. De Courcy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all our presenters for enlightening testimony today. I also want to thank Professor Thomas for bringing his class here. Paul and I both had the pleasure a decade ago to work with Andy Scott, former Member of Parliament for Fredericton, and I know the experience that Paul had, as well as myself, was foundational in leading us on the paths that we're both at today. So to your students, I say soak in what your professor has to offer, because it certainly comes from a lot of in-depth knowledge in the political system, in our political culture. Speaking of political culture, Professor Cross, your testimony has reminded me of fantastic testimony that we received from Marie-Antoinette Flumian, someone with a long and distinguished career in the public service, who spoke about an electoral system as one part of a larger ecosystem that includes, a constitution that has shaped the country, a charter that defends our rights and freedoms, a Supreme Court, a Senate, the public, provinces and provincial governments and the responsibility bestowed upon them, the public service, our relations internationally, the media. These are all factors within the ecosystem that help shape the political culture that leads us to this conversation today, and that are factors that we need to consider in deciding where we go from here. Do you think that, when we ask a poll to Canadians to ask if they think that we should change the electoral system, that they're thinking about the magnitude of issues and of actors and of pieces that will inevitably influence or be influenced by a change?
At this stage, the obvious answer is no. That most Canadians wouldn't understand, or haven't thought through the issue. I'm not sure that that would be the same, that my answer would be the same if we engaged in a year-long consultation and information educative process with Canadians. And in terms of that, I think the New Zealand example, where there were 2 referendums a year apart, was very important, because the first one didn't determine the issue, but it raised consciousness, and people then said, oh, this is something I need to pay attention to. There was a good education process, and I think by the second referendum, there's evidence that New Zealanders did understand what they were voting on, and that's evidenced by the fact that 2 decades later, when they had another referendum, a solid majority reaffirmed their earlier decision after having lived with MMP for a couple of decades.
So to me, that speaks to the importance of a process of validation, of education, of bringing people along with the change and and allowing them to find some level of comfort as things progress. That to me is good testimony to HEAL as a committee. Can you speak to the notion of possible incremental change and how we best may be able to come to some form of consensus to deliver to Parliament, to government, a change that could be palatable for Canadians in a digestible way that they could understand, and or become part of a process of understanding?
Well, again, I think I would point to the New Zealand experience with 2 referendums, so that the first time New Zealanders were not making the definitive choice. And I contrast that with sort of the Ontario or PEI experiences, or even in British Columbia, where voters, showing up in Ontario to a provincial election, thinking they were just going to be voting for their MPP, suddenly were also asked this other question that there hadn't been a lot of discussion about, they hadn't been informed much about it, and so it's not surprising then that you get a sort of a no to change answer. So I think a process that has more time, and I understand that that may not be the case here. You might be working under constraints. I think that makes it more difficult if really the next election, if you expect to have change in place for the next election. And that brings me back to sort of my testimony that also doesn't leave time for parties to adjust and to change their infrastructure.
Right. I forgot that as another part of the ecosystem. But given that list of checks and balances and actors in the political sphere, is it fair to say that the simplistic argument that a majority government has 100% of the power is categorically false?
Oh, I think so. I think that is false. I'm sure every prime minister would say that, wish may wish that he or she would have 100% of the power, but can point to lots of examples where that's not the case. And I think you see that in the way your caucuses and your committees work. This is where I get a bit uncomfortable with the notion of wasted votes. They might not count as much as they should, and there might be questions of equity in our system, but I voted for lots of people who didn't end up as MPs, and I never felt my vote was wasted because I expressed my sentiment, and that was counted. And the government acts differently if it has 52% of the popular vote, I suspect, than if it has 39%.
And yet, democratic modernization and reform is still an important issue that we should be working at.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Corsi, I just have one question for Messrs. Bozinoff and Schatten. We've heard a lot of public opinion polling results, but I haven't heard any public opinion poll on the issue of whether, and I think this is important, whether Canadians like minority governments or whether they're ready for coalition governments. I mean, that's a very central question to our deliberations here, because some systems will give rise to that. Now, maybe Canadians are very, very comfortable with both ideas, but we have no public opinion polling that I've seen or can remember that speaks to how Canadians feel about that. Do you have anything? How would you respond?
I don't think we've asked about that, but we could easily rectify that.
Yeah, and in our current system, we know from previous examples where there's been talk of developing coalition governments. It hasn't been received favorably. They've been fairly unpopular at the federal level. I think most recently the coalition government that Dion was trying to put together. There was a lot of public backlash to that. So maybe in the current system, it is not viewed as favorably. It would be tough to try and assess how that would work in a different type of system.
I just suggest that it would be good to know for our committee, because it's a central question. Well, thank you to all the witnesses for, again, we're at meeting number 44, I think it is, and we thought we'd heard it all, but it's not the case. We're getting original, insightful testimony every day, and today was no exception. Alors, merci beaucoup. Je rappellerai aux membres.
Thank you very much. I remind members that our next meeting is this evening at 5:30 p.m. at the Wellington, 1 Wellington, 5:30 p.m. The meeting, yes, same thing. So 17:30 is 5:30. So it's the proper time is 5:30 at the Wellington building, C110. We'll see you later.